Good afternoon, everyone. We're so excited to have you with us for this first webcast for the 10th season. I can't begin this without first thanking very proudly Lee Cunningham, who's led us through all 10 of these seasons from the very beginning till today and has done an excellent job every step of the way. And so, Lee, thank you so much for what you've done to make the webcast series a major NACADA activity and a hit for the association. And also, Gary, without your technology background, we would not be here at all. So thank you so much to both Lee and Gary for all they've done to make our series work as well as it has. So thank you both. We're excited about today's webcast. First of all, we're excited because it's about a great topic, first generation students. We know that those are students who have issues across the world. It's not just in North America. I was just at the International Conference in Melbourne, and Dr. Debbie Mercer from here and I did a session on first-gen students, and we had about 80 people from across the globe talking about first-gen students. So it's a topic across the world. But it's also exciting because we have three of our board members with us: J.P. Regalado, who's the NACADA president from Texas A&M Corpus Christi; David Spite, NACADA vice president and president-elect from UT Texas at Austin; and Dana Zork, the NACADA vice president-elect from Fox Valley Technical College. The reason this is exciting is all four of us are first-gen students. So we know exactly what our students face every day as they come to campus because we faced it ourselves. So in addition to giving you information and tips about what to do with students, we're going to tell a little bit about our stories as first-gen students. So Lee, let's get started with some of the first ideas. Well, the first thing we need to realize is that 30% of today's higher education are first in the family to attend college. That's a large percentage of our students. And if you look at an institution like Dana's at Fox Valley, it's going to be closer to probably 50 to 60% at a technical college. But that's a large percentage of our students that we must be prepared for as they come. 24% of them are also low income. So when you combine those two risk factors together, we clearly see that this is not a population we can ignore if we're going to be serious about student retention and about graduation of students. And advising is key to that. But only 11% of them graduate within 6 years. That tells us that academic advising is going to be key to these students being successful, and we must plan from day one what we're going to do with them. Next slide. But then when you look, less than 25% of them get a bachelor's degree compared to 68% of the non-first gen peers. That's a drastic difference in percentages. And when we look at that, we have to realize that the first gen population is going to continue to grow. And if we wish to continue to see our graduation rates go up, academic advising has to begin to focus on this special population of students in order to be successful as we move forward. This slide goes back to the webinar that was done back in April. So I'm not going to read all of these to you because many of you saw that webcast. You also have this in your material. But a couple of key things that I want to point out just quickly is these students have a greater difficulty adjusting to college. And that's really important to understand because that's a part of what we're going to talk about in our stories today is our difficulties we had and what we can do to work with that. And then that many times they're less academically but also socially prepared for college. You know, many of our students come totally unprepared for what our culture is. And part of what we must do is help them meet that. So why don't we get started with our stories and hear about what each of us kind of encountered as first-gen students. So we're going to begin with JP. So JP, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Hello, everybody. To tell you a little bit about myself, I have one younger sibling who's 4 years younger. That's who you see on the left picture of me and my sister when we were both in college at a retreat, a church retreat. That's very important because even though it's just me and my sister, we have a lot of aunts and uncles, and therefore I have a lot of cousins and a large extended family. But I was the first on either side of my family to go to college. And I come from a small town called Kyle, Texas. It's about 30 minutes south of Austin, Texas. And it's a type of town where I was known as so-and-so's son or oh, you're Janie's kid. And that's how small our town was. I knew I always wanted to go to college, even though I didn't know what that meant. I knew in part because I was always good in school. I was in classes with classmates who were high achievers, who had family and friends. I couldn't do this today, I think, for most of our institutions, but in my senior year in high school, I did everything. I took the SAT that December. I remember turning in my application to the University of Texas at Austin on the deadline day because I'm a procrastinator and I own that fully. And so the first time, what's important to know is that the first time I ever visited the UT campus after I was admitted was at summer orientation. And remember that my town was only 30 minutes away, but I had never visited the UT campus, let alone any university or college campus. One of the themes in my story is the hidden cost of higher education. My best friend and I commuted to summer orientation because we couldn't afford to live in the residence halls during orientation. And so that's something that to this day I talk to students and families about, is understanding those costs about orientation, about deposits, that people don't necessarily know. And sometimes as institutions, we don't always share that in advance. I came to college undeclared pre-med for three main reasons. Number one, I had spent a lot of time visiting sick family members in the hospital. If you've ever been to a hospital and you see that one family dominate that waiting area, that would have been my extended family. The second reason is because I wanted to help people. And so I thought, hey, be a doctor. And the third reason that I'm not afraid to admit is that I saw George Clooney on TV on a show called ER, and he was a doctor, and he seemed to be living a very good life, helping people. So I thought, hey, that looks good to me. So one of the other themes in my story is not knowing the difference between a major and a career. And this is where advising and career counselors are crucial, especially in my experience with first-generation college students, because we only hear about a very small number of professions. And I think most of you know what I'm talking about. Quite frankly, I didn't know if I was going to make it in college. I was a strong student, had a high motivation to succeed, which again, I think is another strong characteristics of first-generation students, at least in my experience. But my father was very worried about me coming from the small town to go to a campus of 50,000 students and getting swallowed up. Plus, I had someone in my high school who told me that I probably wasn't going to make it at UT. And so I was afraid to fail. I was afraid to fail not just for myself, but because I was afraid to let my family down. And so I had put a tremendous amount of pressure on my shoulders. A third theme of my story is I did what I was told. All those repeated messages that begin at orientation, to what you hear your first semester of going to class, meeting with your professors, utilizing resources, I followed it to a T. And quite frankly, that's how I survived my first semester. Another important part of my story to know is that I commuted my first year in college, and quite frankly, at least half of my college career between home and living, close or to campus. And so my first semester in college was very much like a job to me. I went to school, and occasionally I would stay late to study, but then I went right back home. And in a lot of ways, socially, it was an extension of my high school. After that first semester, I vowed to get more involved. So I started joining a student organization That led to becoming an orientation advisor, which led to getting a job as a peer advisor in the College of Liberal Arts, which led to being involved in other things on campus, including our Student Catholic Center. So my last theme in my story is about finding community. That was very important in my experience. That was very important to keeping me on campus, to enriching my experience, and again, something that to this day I talk to students about. Professionally, I've been very fortunate to work with college students, so I want to give 4 quick tips from my experiences of over 12 years of working with a very specific population of mostly first generation, mostly high financial need. And number 1 would be, does your campus have a one-stop shop? Do they have a place that they can go to? Do they, is that one-stop shop you? And if so, kudos to you. It doesn't mean you or that center needs to know all the answers, but just a place where students can be comfortable to go to and feel welcome. Number 2, being honest. This probably goes for all students, but you know, these first generation students need that honesty. And even if that means giving unpleasant news, it doesn't mean to be dream killers all the time. It just means to be honest with them about what you need to be honest with them about. Number 3, and that's sharing your story, using narrative advising about yourself, about other students, about faculty, about staff. This is advice I give to all faculty that I talk to who ask about working with first generation students, and that's sharing about yourself, letting them know that you're human, and it will make you that much more approachable. And then the last one is to help our first generation students gain that college, institution of higher ed, cultural capital. Navigating our campuses requires a whole new language. And while these students have the skill set, and like I said, the motivation, they don't always know the know-how. And so I've, done role playing with students. We've walked students, or we've used peers to help students. So whatever you can to help these students build that cultural capital. And so that's a little bit of my story. Now I'm going to share it to my colleague, David, to talk about his story.
Which I'm really glad I don't have that haircut anymore. Thank you, JP. My story is a little bit different. So, I have to admit, I was actually really glad to get to participate in this webinar. Some of the stats earlier talked about how so many of first-gen students come from low socioeconomic areas. By no means was I from a family that was horribly wealthy, not at all. But we weren't low socioeconomic. I grew up in what I would describe as white suburbia in Denver, and I had a Japanese mother and an American father, both of which had not completed college. But we were surrounded by families where the parents had gone to college, had completed college degrees. And so I think growing up, there wasn't a thought in my mind that college wasn't something you did. It was just an expectation that everybody that I went to school with went to college. I think oftentimes, too, the people I was around were surprised to find out that my parents hadn't gone to college. For me, I ended up deciding, to take the leap and go to college far from home, 13 hours from home, to a school where I didn't know anybody. And I think for me, some of the challenges that I had to face in my story had a lot to do with things like the admissions process or language and terminology that we use on our campuses, or even understand the financial aid process. So I chose my undergrad because it was out of state and because they gave me a tuition scholarship, which, isn't necessarily take into consideration all the criteria that we really should probably take into consideration when we make decisions. I think you look at the college scorecard that the federal government just put out, and there's all sorts of criteria that I didn't even know we were supposed to consider when choosing possible schools to attend. And then on top of that, talking about financial aid, the first time I ever filled out a FAFSA was 2 years ago when I started my doctoral program. So it wasn't even something that I knew to do. I didn't understand or know what financial aid was or FAFSA was when I applied to college. So I ended up enrolling not aware of a lot of those details that probably would have been helpful on the front end. In terms of what really helped me, though, when I did get to college, I think I went to an institution where there were a lot of people who really made an effort to connect us. So the first person that really kind of connected with us was my resident assistant, my RA. She was really great about helping all of us, whether we were first gen or not, make connections to faculty, to staff, to resources, et cetera. As a point of full disclosure, I will admit part of the reason I spent so much time around my RA was because I thought that she was really cute. So essentially, on some level, I'm in higher ed because I had a really cute RA. But seriously, when I think about my story, the help she provided really kind of led me into higher education. So without her, I probably wouldn't have been successful my first year. I mean, I know my father, when I went to school, thankfully he didn't tell me until I was graduating that he didn't think I would make it through college. But having somebody like that RA to help me connect, to help me be successful, I think was a big part of why I was able to get through college. Another person that was really a great support mechanism for me, a big piece of why I was able to be successful, was the first faculty advisor that I had. He took time to challenge me to consider that first choice of major that I had made, and he explained to me, he was the first person to ever explain to me that major doesn't necessarily matter when it comes to certain types of careers. And really as well, he helped me to navigate my way through that first year of college. Without that, I don't know how successful I would have been. And in general, most of the faculty members I had a chance to interact with at my undergrad were very good about taking that extra time to make sure students were getting the assistance they needed. On top of that, I had some friends and some roommates that first year that were really good about not making me feel like I was less than or not as prepared because I didn't know necessarily all the things that they knew about how college was supposed to work. So they were a big part of how and why I was able to succeed that first year. I think next up, as far as stories go, is Dana. So I'm going to pass it on to Dana.
All right, thank you. A little bit different than David's story. I came from a low socioeconomical status. My family was basically loggers. They lost their logging business the year before I went off to college. So we were basically living on my mom's waitressing income. And I remember being told by my guidance counselor, I mentioned to them that I was interested in being a counselor. And he said I should be a court reporter because I could type fast. So that's an example of some poor career planning advice there. But I'm pretty stubborn, and so I went on to do what I wanted to do. And that just does go to show that how much of a factor motivation is when you're talking about college success. So I went to a small school. I had 36 people in my high school class. So I had the big fish in a little bowl and moving to a little fish in a big bowl. So it was quite a culture shock when I went on to college that way. I didn't understand the financial aid, the whole FAFSA process, so I filed it late, not understanding the consequences that had. I did not have the money to hold my dorm room. I thought that the magical financial aid fairy would take care of all that, not understanding that some of those things had to be paid up front. So I remember my brother writing a check out for me as I was crying because I didn't think I'd be able to go to college. Also, first started that first day, I didn't have book money because I didn't have my financial aid all in place. So that was a difficult entry. I already stressed out when you're starting off with college. I studied the night before in high school, and I did fairly well. I was a 3.8. But as some of you know, too, high school grades aren't always a predictor of how successful you're going to be at college. And I, unfortunately, was one of those stories. My first semester at college, I ended up with a 2.0, and I wasn't quite sure why. I did end up taking a college success class, and I quickly figured out I didn't have the study skills or the time management skills that were necessary in order for me to do well. So I learned that I started studying at the library, getting all my homework done before I'd go back to the dorms, because I'm one of those people that I'm so easily distracted. If I'd go back to the dorms and someone would ask me to do just about anything, I would say yes, other than do my schoolwork. So that was one thing that kind of helped me that an advisor suggested. And I still to this day tell my students that study while you're here. When you go home, it's your own time. The ironic part about all this is that I teach college success, and it's kind of funny because I can talk about all of my mistakes and how I overcame them. I even tell my students I'm a recovering procrastinator. When I talked about that time management piece, that was really hard for me to overcome. So I talked to my students about how I overcame that and used some of those tips. I was also very homesick. I went home every weekend when I was in college to start off with because I was homesick. I remember calling and saying I wanted to quit. My mom said, come on home, we'll take you in. And then when I called my dad, he had a different story. He said, no, you're staying. So it just demonstrates the importance of support systems. And as much as my mom loved me, wanted me to come home, sometimes being overprotective and wanting to guard you from feeling uncomfortable is not a good thing. So this is a good chance where you bring parents into the conversations and talk about change in general is uncomfortable, but that doesn't necessarily mean you want to give up. So good conversations with those parents. And then lastly, the piece that really helped me was getting engaged on the campus. My friends talked me finally into not going home every weekend, hanging out and making friends. And they even talked me into going out for cheerleading, which I did quite a bit in high school, getting involved in some clubs. I became a work study, got to know the faculty and the advisors that way. I was also assigned an advisor who was a generalist at first, and that person just helped me register for classes and sent me on my way. So I didn't have that connection. But when I got my core course faculty advisor, it helped make that connection. He knew about the field of psychology and counseling and asked me about my outside life and talked about what I really wanted to do with my major. And just when I started feeling comfortable, my father had an accident. And because he lived on his own, I was the only family member that was able to help care for him. So it just demonstrates that there's many kinds of transitions in a student's life. I think of there's anticipated transitions such as graduation, going to college, and then there are unanticipated transitions, which is what I had gone through. So the unanticipated ones are typically more stressful and need more support. And I did fortunately have that support. All right, I am actually going to turn it over to Charlie, who has a much better photo than I do.
You know, I'm on this webcast mainly because I started college as a first generation before these three were even born. So that's part of that. And my photo is better, Dana, because my hair is as big as yours was within that time. So my story is just exactly like Dana's. I was a cheerleader in college and all of those wonderful things. No, just kidding. Many of you have heard my story. I'm the youngest of three children. And none of my older brother never went to college. My sister went to college after she was married and had children. I was told my entire life I was going to college, but I had no idea how. And end of July of the summer before I started the local community college, the registrar called me at work at Sears and said, "I hear you come to college." And I said, "Yes, sir, I am." And he said, "You might want to apply," because I did not even know I had to apply. I was just going to show up. Just like a lot of our students just show up. You know, it's interesting to hear Dana and JP and David talk about the fast fund, financial aid. I didn't even know those things existed. They may not have in the Stone Age, but I didn't even know that you did. There was such a thing called a financial aid. So I was one of those students that really was totally unprepared for what I was going to encounter in college. I also had a father who was very clear that said, you get started, I don't pay for C's, and you get out. So I graduated from high school in 1974, so before these three was born, and then was automatically back teaching at that same high school in August of 1977. So I did my undergraduate in 3 years. I went every semester. I did 17 to 18 hours a semester because I thought that's what you were supposed to do. I didn't know you were supposed to do anything differently. I did great grades. I had a good GPA, but I can honestly tell you that I don't remember anything about my undergraduate education. And that's not because I was stoned all the time, even though that picture looks like I was. It was because I simply was not engaged in any way. You know, I was a commuter student. I went to class, I came home, I left, I went to work, I came to class. Even when I moved to the University of Georgia as a junior in college, I still lived off campus and only went to campus for class within that. It really wasn't until my doctorate program, in which I had a cohort of folks that we went all the way through together, that I can really say I felt like I had a collegiate experience. So one of the things that I've always tried to do with first generation students is to tell my own story and to get them to understand that college is more than just about grades. Yes, we want you to graduate. Yes, we want you to have great GPAs, but you need to enjoy that undergraduate experience. It's an experience that you'll never get to have again. It's an experience that will be something that is life-changing if you allow it to be. And I've always regretted that I did not have that type of experience within that. So as we think about our first-generation students, I encourage you as you work with them to really talk to them about that engagement piece in addition to those study habits and the financial aid forms and all of those pieces because it's so important to what they do and what happens. So this time I'm going to turn it back over to JP, who's going to talk about some of the things we need to do as we work with students in the pre-admissions part.
Thank you, Charlie. So we're now sort of going to talk about, if you look at page 3 of the handout, that you'll see how we sort of split this up. And while we're not going to hit every single point, we're going to highlight some points and expand on some of them. So the very next slide I want to show you is about what kind of relationship do you have with your feeder schools. I believe most institutions have some, definitely some local schools around them or schools that you recruit from. And I understand and recognize that for many of us, especially in advising, that we may not be involved in the enrollment management part, in the recruiting part. And so for those of you who don't have a part in that, again, just knowing what those areas do in those high schools, what kind of information do they share? I've been fortunate in different positions where recruiting has been part of what I do, and I have gotten to visit schools and talk to prospective students and families. And so it's not just about establishing that presence, but also what you do with that presence. What kind of information do you share? A big question we get, from all of our students, but especially first-generation students, is about financial aid. And I am not a financial aid counselor, but I know just enough to give them some basic information, or I make it my job to have direct connections with our financial aid officers, with people that either I can contact or that I can refer our students and their families. How do we utilize our current first-generation students and graduates? And that could be obviously our current student body, recent alumni, staff, faculty who are first-generation students. What is the message, and are we all in the same message? Language is very important. You'll hear a little bit about this, especially from David and Dana, about the kind of language that we use and the kind of language that's higher ed speak that doesn't necessarily translate to someone who has no concept or idea what we're talking about. And so I'm not necessarily saying to simplify language, but just to think about the language. And so a very easy suggestion is, in any printed materials, in any presentation you're doing, in any language that you're using, whether it's in meetings with prospective students and their families, whether you have students who come to your campus for events, recruiting events that in advising you participate in, or like I said, if you go recruiting, you want to test out that language with your current students, and especially if you have first generation students, share with them the information that you're going to talk about and get their input, because it's very important, especially for those of you who may not be first generation, who don't necessarily have that experience. I was fortunate where I could use my experience that shaped my messages with these students. And then a very sort of really intentional initiative you could do as an institution is, do you have some sort of landing page or web page or website resource page for first generation college students? You might have an office on your campus, whether from a grant or maybe just an institutional program for first generation students that you could utilize to get information, to refer your students, or like in what you see here from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and their Office of Admissions page, a specific page that's dedicated and targeted for first generation students. Again, the key here is, what is the message? What are we saying? We can't make assumptions that students even know what things like FAFSA are. We can't make assumptions that students automatically know all the majors that we have and what those majors mean. I mean, an example that I use on our campus is, we have a lot of students who are physical therapy and automatically assume that they should choose health sciences. And that's in our College of Nursing and Health Sciences, when we have sort of a pre-health profession track in our science and engineering. And then we have kinesiology that also could be an option. Well, students don't know about that. So how do we get that information? And then again, this is where the expertise from advising comes in. So again, just another sort of tip is what kind of information do you share when students are researching your institution? How intentional are we about information for first-generation college students? And I'm going to hand it over to Dana.
All right. Thanks, JP. All right. Simply put, the admissions process creates a first impression for students that they get of your college. It can either make or break that first year experience, and it's the beginning of the student's understanding of the entire college culture. They will know if you care from the moment that they hear that first communication, based on the timing of that communication, the amount of communication, and the delivery of that communication, right down to the customer service they receive from the moment they make the call to address those first questions about college. So we've all heard this before, but checklists, prerequisites, understanding the college language, that can all be new and stressful for first generation college students. The testing process alone can cause a great amount of anxiety. So talking through that admissions process from the moment of application, navigating that checklist, and then talking about those next steps is crucial. Knowing who they can call and getting that assistance from is even more crucial. So just for fun, I actually took our admissions assessment not too long ago because I wanted to know exactly what the students were going through. Now, I might not have that same anxiety, but I want to know exactly the process because sometimes we forget what it is like. So imagine being a first-generation college student who is not familiar with the testing process, plus they have the added stress of knowing there's a time constraint and not necessarily understanding the impact of their score. So some tips to help students is review your communications regularly and make sure they're in the language a student would understand. Have a student read them and provide feedback. I actually use my peer advisors for this. I have them critique my communications and then provide feedback on whether it's understandable or in a student's language. For example, sometimes here we'll say you've been matriculated, and I always tell people that's not painful, don't worry. Basically, that means you now are enrolled in your program. So be careful when we use some of that terminology that we're making sure students do understand what that is. Ensure the students know and understand how they will receive the information they'll be seeking, and make it transparent how and when they'll receive that next communication to cut down on the worry time, as well as to avoid a number of unnecessary phone calls in your office. This is also a great time to discuss FERPA regulations, such as release of information reminders for parents, because as we talked earlier, they do enter into the conversations, and if you talk about it up front that they need to have that signed release, it doesn't make it stressful when they call later on in the process, and then we say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you about that, you need that release. So put it out there up front and let them know if they want the parents involved to do that release. If you ask a student what their worst fear is about coming to college, they might not always be able to come up with those items right up the top of their head. Like I talked in my story, I didn't necessarily know that I wasn't going to do well in college. I actually thought, oh, I did well in high school, I should do well in college. So it can be helpful to provide a list of anticipated barriers or fears a student might have. And many times they will check items they weren't even thinking about since they haven't had a family member attending college in the past. So this example I have up here is what we use here at Fox Valley Technical College. It helps start conversations at an early point. So as an advisor, you can work with that student being proactive rather than waiting for some of these things to happen. And it also helps you determine which first-generation college students are more at risk in comparison to other students. So sometimes if I get a student that's checked 4 or 5 of those, I know I need to case manage that one a bit more than maybe somebody who's checked 1 or 2 items. A copy of this is actually included in your handout, so be sure to check that out and feel free to adapt it at your own institution. How many times have we told students, well, you received that information orientation, or we sent you a letter on that? And we all know that from learning research that if you hear something once, the chances of retaining it are less likely than if we've repeated it in various formats. Also keeping in mind that too much of a good thing is also a good rule. Do you remember receiving too many letters from college that you stopped reading them? I'm pretty sure that's probably what happened with my financial aid letters. I had one student who actually stopped reading her email the other day because she was inundated by emails from our student life area on things such as National Peanut Butter Sandwich Day. She was annoyed. She said, I don't have time to read all these emails. So be careful not to send too many things and try to send them at important moments and times. So if you're working with a student in your office, provide a deadline list or have them put alerts on their electronic calendar. I've even created a next step list so they understand what needs to be done by priority. Because sometimes it can be a little overwhelming if we give them a list and they don't know which thing to do first. So kind of help them prioritize those lists as well. After working through the admission stage with a student, you'll have identified some gaps, and it's great to have systems in place to help identify those gaps since you won't be able to address them all single-handedly on your own. So programs such as boot camps, interim or summer programs for study skills, pre-science programs, those are all examples of some things that you can use to help address. And these events can go anywhere from a few hours to a day to a couple of weeks, but all of them are intended to give students a preview of that college experience, meet staff, and begin building friendships and support systems. Just an example of that for here at Fox Valley, we have a cohort experience for our culinary arts students, and they spend 3 hours in a kitchen boot camp the week before classes start, so they become familiar with their classmates, navigating the kitchens and classrooms, so they hit the ground running that first week. And then all faculty attend that, they introduce themselves, divide the students up according to their advisors, and they use a rotating system so that each of the students get to know the faculty members well before that. First year placement can be tricky, so now that you've identified some of those barriers, those potential barriers will carry into discussions of determining appropriate placement for that first year. So helping them determine credit load based on student lifestyle. If they're working, how much are they working? Have they struggled with a certain subject in the past? Try and find a course or two that helps them get excited and create that confidence that they need to be successful. Encourage them to add a college success class. I know some of you may have a first year experience, for example, where you require that class, which is wonderful. But as I talked earlier, when I went from that 3.8 in high school to that 2.0, it was largely due to my lack of study skills. So taking that class gave me the foundation that I needed. When determining course placement, it's a good idea to review the student's high school experience, not always relying solely on those placement tests. I was pushed into advanced English because I did well in the placement test, but English was not a good subject for me. Had I discussed that with someone, perhaps maybe it would have changed where I started. So it's always important to ask why they felt the way they did about their high school course or experience. So did they not do well because of their learning style? Was it their motivation, the disinterest in the material? And that all plays a role in that career planning discussion. So I do ask my new students who their cheerleaders are and who their energy vampires are. Who are those people that support you 100% when you're coming to school? And I ask them who provides encouragement, who gives you a ride, who borrows you money for gas. Some of our students have people in their lives that will sabotage their college experience, and we'll discuss how to address those vampires, further develop those healthy support systems, and how to seek and identify new support systems, which would be people such as us in the advising realm. These support systems are both external and internal, and students may come in having a great support system outside of college, but it's our job to assist in developing those interpersonal relationships within the campus culture. So getting them involved, as I had talked earlier. All right, I'm actually going to pass it off to David to talk a little bit about the ongoing support piece.
All right, thank you, Dana. Generally speaking, now they're on our campuses, what kind of support can we provide them ongoing? One of the things that advisors do, obviously, is we strive to build a strong initial rapport with students. For all students, whether first gen or not, making connections to the institution becomes an important factor in whether or not they persist. This is definitely true for first generation students who may feel that everyone else just appears to know what they need to know about college. And so building that connection is really important. Another piece that is important in terms of what advisors can do in terms of ongoing support is continually assess student knowledge acquisition and their social and cultural capital. So for example, how do these students know what they're supposed to know when they don't know what they're supposed to know? Well, part of that is it's our responsibility to help understand kind of where they're at with their knowledge acquisition and to figure out how to help them successfully navigate their way through our institutions. It's important that we don't make assumptions about their prior knowledge. And it's additionally important that we think about the language we use. You've heard that a few times already today, but for example, here someone might say at orientation, well, welcome to UT Austin. It's a Research One institution. I don't know that first generation students, or really most students, are going to know what Research One means. Or for example, why don't you just go over to the ARC office or the SSC or some other abbreviation that we use, not realizing that students may not understand what those abbreviations mean. Advisors should also aid students in really figuring out what those educational and life plans are going to be. For a lot of first-generation students, they may not know about all the different educational options or post-college opportunities that are really available to them. They often come with a very limited set of options that they think are possibilities when they come to college. And so, we can open up their minds and help them find out about majors and other career possibilities that they may not have thought about. And so we play a real important role in that. In terms of generally on a campus, a couple of things that we can do campus-wide. We can create a first-generation living learning community, for example, on those communities, those institutions that have residential communities. Living learning communities, according to George Koo, are one of the high-impact educational practices that are out there. And what he says is that the key goals for learning communities are to encourage integration of learning across courses and to involve students with big questions that matter beyond the classroom. Students take 2 or more linked courses as a group and work closely with one another and with their professors. Many learning communities explore a common topic and or common readings through the lenses of different disciplines. And so it deliberately links some of the liberal arts and some of the professional courses and often features sometimes service learning. These learning communities foster inclusive environments of collaboration that help first-generation students develop both academically and socially. It helps students by combining and fusing their learning with what's going on in the residence halls and what's going on outside the classroom. In particular, Koo and Banta talk about how successful learning living communities aid in the overall student success and encourage collaborative efforts amongst institutional leadership, and that it aids in providing first-generation students a better awareness of academic adequacy and helps them adjust to the rigors of college. So how does this affect you as an advisor? Well, advisors in some cases may be facilitators of living learning communities themselves, or a faculty advisor might also be a faculty member teaching one of the courses that's associated with their community. Or minimally, you may be someone who's advising the students who are part of these communities. This is where advisors can aid students in seeing the connections between what they're learning in the classroom and the experiences they have outside the classroom. Advisors can also conduct group advising sessions for first-generation students. This is a great way for students to maybe find an answer to something they didn't even know was a question they needed to ask because somebody else asked it in that group session. It's also important, though, again, to consider language, institutional terminology, and so forth. Now, some examples of institutions that have some of these living learning communities for first-gen students are going to include the University of Cincinnati, the University of Kentucky, and Southern Connecticut State University. These programs provide living spaces and programming that really fosters those supportive relationships. Something else that you can do is establish and support student organizations for first-generation students. Student organizations in general, as you know, are an important resource to help students integrate into the institutional environment. We know that if they integrate socially and academically, according to Tinto, then they're more likely to persist at our institutions. And so on some level, we're all looking for that place that we feel we fit, and having a student organization where you see others like you provides just that. Student organizations are designed to support first-gen students and help that are designed for them are really designed to help them and the campus community as well become more informed. It helps the campus community become more aware of the population of first-generation students, and it helps reduce some of the stigma or the misinformed stereotypes that sometimes people have about first-generation students. Academic advisors may also find that they serve as an advisor to a student organization. So additionally, they may be somebody who's helping kind of put these organizations together. It's important that advisors, whether they're an advisor to an org or not, are aware of the student organizations that exist on their campus. They need to make sure that they're assessing and increasing their own cultural competency. And they also need to work to connect first-gen students with others on the campus, faculty, staff, and peers who are or were themselves first-generation students. An example you see on the slide there is from MIT called the First Generation Program, which was an organization that originally was run by students, and it's now actually housed in the undergraduate advising office. And there's a dedicated staff member that works with that organization. Something else you can also do is really enlist mentors, whether peer mentors or faculty mentors. We know that mentoring programs help first-year students successfully transition to an institution. It helps them persist. It helps them feel that they belong. So having someone who can relate to many of the issues and challenges that they're facing really kind of helps integrate them into the institutional environment. One of the important attributes of mentoring programs, though, to remember is that mentoring requires a reciprocal relationship, that it's not just that the mentee is getting something out of it, but that there's also some benefit for the mentor. And For advisors in particular, this is a chance for you to be able to increase your cultural competency. By engaging in that relationship, you learn more about others who have a different experience than your own, which can then benefit other students that you help in the future. There's an example at St. Mary's University in San Antonio where roughly 45% of the students are first generation. Students are put in something called the Faculty Academic Mentor Program, where they're actually placed in a group with 4 others who are also first gen. There's a peer mentor and a faculty mentor. So they really get a chance to work with a faculty member, a peer mentor, and connect with others going through the same thing. It is important when we think about all these things, though, that we reach these students without making them feel marginalized. For some first-generation students, being labeled or singled out is kind of how they feel when we say, hey, you're a first-generation student, here's this great thing for you. So as mentioned before, we want them to feel like they fit in, but we don't want them to feel like they're being marginalized, because that sense of marginalization, it becomes a huge barrier for these students to integrate into the institution. And it may lead to them even avoiding asking for assistance or utilizing some of the resources available. So it's important as advisors that we consider how any of the programs we provide might make them feel marginalized. Again, having an increased awareness and cultural competency is key. Remember, first-generation student is not simply a first-generation student or a first-generation student first. There are so many intersections of identity for each student, and each student is unique. So as mentioned before, remember to work on building that strong initial rapport to increase your own cultural competence, and assess where your students are at in their knowledge acquisition and their cultural capital. Help them learn how to navigate their way through the institution and get them connected to involvement opportunities, to faculty, to staff, and to other students. All right, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Charlie now. Charlie?
I think the audience can clearly see why these were the best 3 folks to have on this panel today, because not only did they experience exactly what our first generation students do, but they've also committed their careers to working specifically with those students and done such a beautiful job of bringing together ideas from across the country about what's going on. So let me thank JP and Dana and David as we move into our last few minutes here. As we're finishing up these last couple of slides, if you could start, if you have any questions, typing those into the chat box, we'll be glad to answer those as we move forward. So let me kind of wrap up what we've talked about today, the big picture of what we're looking at. First of all, first generation students need more attention than other students. I know that sounds redundant. I know that sounds like a NACADA statement, but it really is the truth that we can't forget that. And we many times do, and we have to identify them. One of the things a lot of our campuses are doing a really good job of identifying the data we need to have up front on our students in order to predict their success. First generation is one of those pieces of data. And then David and Dana and JP all gave excellent examples of what we have to do, which is we have to learn from each other and we have to work with each other. That's the beauty of NACADA, is we learn from each other, we work from each other. So all of you have great things that are occurring on your campuses. Share those as you go through on Twitter, as you keep going, as we look at our questions and answers, because you're doing great work. So Dana, I'm going to let you talk a few minutes about the documentary that K-State has put together.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. The inspiration for this webinar was actually a documentary produced by K-State, and the webinar is titled A Walk in My Shoes, and that can be purchased through the NACADA bookstore. All the proceeds go to academic advising for academic advising scholarships. And just to give you an example how our department used this, we held a lunch and learn where we viewed the documentary, and what we did is we offered 2 different sessions so staff could rotate, everybody could see that. We provided popcorn because, like students, food draws, and when we introduced it as a popcorn in a movie, of course that was a nice package deal to get them to come. We also gave out the article, which is in your resources. It's called Practical Ways We Can Assist First Generation Students, and then we held a discussion afterwards and talked about how we could implement some of those similar ideas for Fox Valley Technical College first generation students. So I'll hand it back to Charlie so we can get started on the question and answer session.
Well, right before that, we just sort of want to do a plug for an April webinar that a webinar, I'm sorry, next April 2016, that, I'm sorry, let me look at this again. There will be a webinar March 2016 called Advising Needs of First Generation Students, taking a closer look. So we just wanted to make you aware of this if you were interested in continuing this conversation in the spring. So, and now I will go back to Charlie, who's going to facilitate our question and answers, because you are bringing in questions and we appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Just a reminder that everyone participating today, you will get a link to the video, the documentary for 30 days that you can download and look at and use. So don't forget that's part of this webcast today. You have a way of getting that and looking at it and using it. We've got some really great questions here. Rachel Broderick says, do you have any ideas on encouraging student engagement and creating student organizations for first-gen students? JP, you want to respond to that one?
Sure. I do think, I mean, I obviously agree with David and the research that this is a good idea, but this does bring up a good point, you know, and I think several of you have asked this question, well, what if you don't know if your students are first generation, or what if students don't identify themselves as first generation students? And this probably would have been my category, what if as a student I wouldn't necessarily have wanted to be identified as a first generation student? How do you walk that balance between supporting those students, providing what they need, but also treating them like anyone else? And with that, you know, is this idea of the student organizations. Well, first of all, you need to know, is there such a thing that exists on your campus? I think it's not surprising to many of us that sometimes we find out that things exist on our campus that we had no idea. And so, you know, where is your area on your campus for student organizations? Is there a list of them online? Where can you find it? Who are your contacts to get that information? If it doesn't exist, you know, do you think that would be a good idea for your campus? Again, gauging the culture of your campus. If you think it's a good idea, then, you know, what are the steps to creating that? And for a campus that I worked at, you just needed 3 students. They needed to pay a small fee, and basically they could start their own organization. And basically you would empower those students to basically recruit other students. And so I don't know if that answers that first question, but those are just some ideas.
Thank you, JP. Several of you are asking questions about how do you get the data to know about students? How do you get the information that you need to have? Many campuses, as I talked about just a few moments ago, are really talking and working very diligently on the whole concept of predictive analytics, looking at what is the data we need to know up front, finding ways to ask that data in particular systems, technology systems, or other venues within that. Our winter seminar in February is going to be built around the concept of data analytics and using data to drive decision making, and we'll be talking about how you gather that type of data. So that is a big piece of what you all need to be doing, is as an advising community on your campus, what are those pieces of data that you know you want to ask and find out about, and then how do you gather that? It may be through a new technology system. It may be through an orientation program. There are many ways of doing it, but until you've defined first what the technology is that you want to have, the data that you want to have, you won't know how to gather it. So we need to think about that. David, how about the question on diversity that was asked a little earlier on in relation to first-gen students?
Well, I think both Rita's question about how do you address issues of alienation with families of students who are first gen, as well as the diverse questions, are very related. I think part of it is obviously they're a part of a very important community. You know, I think JP talked about it in his story. It was a great example of this, where he was very connected to his family, and then all of a sudden you're in this new environment, this new culture that is different. And how do you have one foot in both places, and how do you manage that transition. I think a big part of what we do as advisors is we really help students to be able to navigate that new culture, to become more aware, to gain that cultural capital of the institution, but at the same time maintain that connection with their support system that they had before they got there. I think we often don't think, which is why I'm really glad that Rita asked this question, we don't think about the effect that sending someone to college might have on parents who are not necessarily aware of what college should be or don't understand what it's about. And in some cases, parents are going to be very supportive. You heard that in some of our stories. And in some cases, parents are not going to be very supportive. And it's because of a lack of understanding. So I think a big part of how we address that as a campus is the messaging, not only for students, but the messaging that we provide to their families as well. So I think that's a big piece of it. But I definitely recommend on the diversity side of things, we talked about this earlier, about becoming more culturally competent yourself as an advisor, to be aware of some of maybe the theories on student development related to diversity. Those can also be really helpful too.
Thank you, David. Dana, Cynthia Pascal asked a question about your boot camp program that you talked about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Cynthia's question is, how do you get students to participate in those? There's several different ways that we've attempted to do that, and several of them I've actually stolen from NACADA members. You have great ideas that they share. We just recently started where we could get them to come to the boot camps and workshops by, we called it Fuel It Up. And if they come to a session, we give them a $5 gas card at the end of the session. Another way we've done things is we'll actually go into the classrooms and do some of the boot camps. If we work with the faculty and they give us some screen time, we'll go in. We actually, someone on the NACADA listserv called it "Don't Cancel That Class," where instead of having a faculty member cancel a class, we would go in and deliver some of those boot camps. I thought that was a great idea. And lastly, we actually offer credit for some of them. And then in some cases, we have some scholarships to pay for those credits as well. So there's always got to be that hook. You're right. We tried to get them in because we thought it sounded like a great thing to do, and we had low enrollment, so we had to get creative that way.
Great. JP, Sia McConnell asked a question about one of the comments that you made about resources. You want to respond to that question, please?
Sure. I think to the question about how do you, if you don't always have the students who need the resources you offer, or if you have a one-stop shop, how do you get them to take most advantage of it? And I think like anything else, it's utilizing a combination of strategies. So how do you get the information out using your current students who do use it, using social media to get the word out? I think a really very effective way is if your faculty are willing to give you a few minutes. For example, those large lecture classes, or those classes where there are significant numbers of first-year students, that if you have a few minutes to share about your resources is a great way, because we've done that. I've done that in different campuses to get the word out in our first-year seminars and learning communities, or just large lecture classes, just to spend a few words on the resources that we have. And I think that might be a way to just get the message out, and certainly to get it to faculty as well.
Thank you, JP. We probably have time for maybe one more question, and I'll respond to a couple very, very quickly. Kimberly Smith asked about gaps in research in first gen. There's been a lot of research in the past few years. There were a couple of issues of the Chronicle that were totally built upon first generation students. I just happened to pick up a new book today called First Generation Students that's come out by Lee Ward and Michael Siegel. That's an excellent resource. So yes, there are research gaps, but there's also some good research that's come out there as well. Another person asked about data systems and technology. NACADA, of course, doesn't endorse any technology system out there, but at our winter seminar, we will be having institutions talking that are using specific technology systems and how they're using those to gather the data they need to have on their campuses. So that might be something you want to follow and look at. I want to take this time to really thank all of you for being here today. Thank JP and Dana and David. What a wonderful job you did. Great rounds of applause to the three of you for the great job. We really, really thank you. We're fortunate to have such excellent board members and great leaders who also understand what our students are going through. And then last, Lee and Gary and E, what you do behind the scenes, no one ever truly sees, and we all do. So we can't thank you enough for what you do. So everyone have a great afternoon. Have a great day, and we'll look forward to seeing about 4,000 of you in Las Vegas in just a few days. Have a great day.